The dog had already been sedated once when Vera Olmstead walked through the wrong door. She wasn't supposed to be in that wing of the base. She'd come to CFB Trenton looking for Staff Sergeant Wickham, who owed her a signature on a patient transfer form, and someone had pointed her toward Building C when they meant Building D. And now she was standing in a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and wet fur, staring through a wire-reinforced window at an 80-pound Belgian Malinois lying on his side, with his legs moving like he was still running somewhere in his sleep. The nameplate on the kennel said Kodiak. Below it, in smaller letters, MWD 44 Swamantine, and below that, handwritten on a sticky note that someone had pressed to the frame, "Do not, without handler, off aversion." That was the whole problem. Vera had been a flight nurse with 8 Wing for 3 years. She'd done 2 rotations in Kandahar and 1 in Latvia. She'd seen a lot of things she hadn't been prepared for, but nothing had quite prepared her for the look on the face of the young corporal who came hurrying down the corridor when he spotted her standing there. "Ma'am, this area's restricted." "I know. I'm sorry. I'm looking for Building Da. This is I gathered that." She nodded toward the window. "What's wrong with him?" The corporal, his name tape said Enkemdarim, hesitated. He was maybe 22, with tired eyes and a tension in his jaw that told her he hadn't slept well in several days. "He's being assessed," Enkemdarim said. "For what?" Another hesitation. "Ma'am, really? You need to? Is he sick?" "No, ma'am." He looked at the dog, and something crossed his face that Vera recognized. She'd seen it in the families of patients who'd been given news they didn't know how to carry yet. "He's not sick." She looked at the sticky note again. The date handwritten in the corner was 4 days ago. "His handler," she said. "That's who's missing." And Kemdarim didn't answer. He didn't have to. His name had been Master Corporal Denis Chartrand, and he'd been found at the base of a ravine off Hay W2 outside of Belleville 3 weeks prior. The initial report said accident. Single vehicle, early morning, black ice. It had taken almost 2 weeks for anyone to start asking questions. And those questions had come not from the military police, but from Chartrand's sister, a woman named Odette, who lived in Kapuskasing and who called the base 7 times before anyone called her back. Vera learned all of this later. On the day she walked through the wrong door, all she knew was that a dog had lost his person. And the people responsible for deciding what happened next had run out of options. She found out about the euthanasia order 2 days later, from Enkemdarim, who had apparently decided she was someone he could tell things to. He found her in the mess at Zo 630, sat down across from her with a coffee he didn't drink, and said, "They're scheduling it for Friday." Vera put down her fork. "How long has he been with the unit?" 6 years, since he was 18 months, and nobody can work with him. He put Sergeant Gruel in the infirmary. Gruel's the best canine handler on the base. Kodiak let him get within 4 feet, and then Nkemdarim stopped. He's not aggressive. That's the thing. He's not a dangerous dog. He's a dog that's in a lot of pain and doesn't understand what happened to his person, and the way he shows that is... He stopped again. "The way he shows that is the part that's getting him killed," Vera said. Nkemdarim looked at his untouched coffee. "Friday," he said again. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in her bunk in the residence and stared at the ceiling and thought about Kandahar, about a specific afternoon in Kandahar, about a dog that had been attached to the EOD team she was embedded with, a dog named Prosper who had belonged to a warrant officer from Chicoutimi. When the warrant officer had been medivaced out with a shattered femur, Prosper had refused to eat for 6 days. Vera had been the one to sit with him, not because she had training in it, not because anyone had asked her to, just because she'd been there and the dog had been alone and it had seemed like the obvious thing to do. What she remembered most was the commands. The warrant officer, his name had been Jourdain, and he'd lost the leg eventually but made it home, had used French, not standard French, Jourdain French, which was a specific dialect that involved a lot of vocabulary Vera had never encountered in her 2 semesters at Queen's, but she'd listened to him work with Prosper every day for 4 months, and some of it had stuck. She sat up in her bunk at 0200 and thought, I wonder if Chartrand used French. Chartrand was from Hearst, Northern Ontario. His personnel file, which she had absolutely no authorization to access, would have told her. But she didn't need the file. She needed Odette. She called Odette Chartrand the next morning, from a payphone in the PX. Because she didn't want the call on her mobile. and she said she was a nurse at the base and she was sorry for her loss, and she had a question that was going to sound strange. Odette was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're the one who's going to help Kodiak." It wasn't a question. "I want to try," Vera said. "Denis talked to him in French," Odette said. "Joual. Not textbook French. Denis grew up with my mother, and my mother's family was from Hearst. You know how they talk up there." The military tried to make him use standard commands, but he said Kodiak didn't respond as well. He kept the old commands. "Do you know any of them?" Odette was quiet again. Then he wrote them down for Kodiak's file. He told me once that he was worried something would happen to him, and no one would know how to talk to the dog. Her voice caught on the word worried. "I have the list. He sent me a copy." She drove to Kapuskasing the next day. She called in a personal day, borrowed a colleague's car, and drove 4.5 hours north on 17 through snow that turned serious around Sudbury and didn't let up until she was almost there. Odette Chartrand was a small woman in her late 50s with Denis's same dark eyes, and she made tea that Vera drank without tasting, and she gave Vera a sheet of paper covered in her brother's handwriting. The drive back was long and quiet. Vera read the list at a Tim Hortons in Matheson, sitting in her car with the engine running for warmth, and she said each word out loud to the windshield until she felt sure of them. She went to see Kodiak on Thursday morning. She didn't tell anyone. She signed herself into the kennel log as attending a routine medical check on a listed patient, which was technically within her scope if she interpreted the word routine generously, and she walked down to his kennel alone at 0640 before the day shift was properly awake. The kennel smelled like old fear, not the dog, the room. She'd noticed that in Kandahar, too, the way anxiety had a smell that accumulated in enclosed spaces and didn't leave. Kodiak was in the back corner of his kennel, lying with his chin on his forepaws, watching the door. He didn't move when she crouched down outside the gate. He just watched her with flat, dark eyes that held nothing readable. She waited. She'd learned that from Jourdain, too, the waiting. You don't rush a working dog. You let them assess you. You let them decide. After 4 minutes, Kodiak shifted his weight. Not much. Just enough to indicate that he was still interested in the question of who she was. She said quietly, the first word on Denis Chartrand's list. It was a recall command, not the standard one. Chartrand's version, the Hearst version, a French word that wasn't in any textbook Vera had ever opened. She said it once and then waited. Kodiak raised his head. She said the second word. A sit command. He stood up. She said the third word. Rest, but not quite. Something between rest and something older. And he was at the gate before she finished it, pressing his nose against the wire, his tail moving in a slow, uncertain arc like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to want what he wanted. Vera pressed her palm flat against the wire and said, "Okay, buddy, I've got you." She sat on the floor of the kennel corridor for 40 minutes that morning, talking to him through the gate. She didn't touch him. She didn't push it. But when she left, he was standing at the front of the kennel watching her go, and his tail was still moving. She went back that afternoon and convinced the corporal on duty. Not in Kandahar, a different one. A young woman named Hessler who looked at Vera's uniform and her quiet certainty and decided the math added up to let her into the kennel itself. Kodiak pressed his entire body against her legs and didn't move for 20 minutes. The euthanasia order was canceled that evening. Vera found out from Kandahar, who texted her a single word, "Friday's off." She called him back immediately. What happened? Commander Zwicker saw the report from Hessler. He's extending the assessment period by 30 days. A pause. He also wants to know who you are and why you were in the kennel. What did you tell him? That you were a nurse who got lost looking for Building Da. That's true? I know. She could hear him almost smiling. He wants to meet you. Commander Zwicker was a broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s who had the particular manner of someone who had spent decades calibrating the line between rules and outcomes and had gotten comfortable operating right on it. She met Vera in her office the following morning and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. "Tell me about the commands," Vera told her. About Jourdain. About Prosper. About the drive to Kapuskasing and the sheet of paper covered in Denis Chartrand's handwriting. Zwicker listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Can you teach them to someone else?" "I don't know yet. Kodiak needs time before he trusts anyone new. We have 30 days. Then we'll know in 30 days. Zwicker looked at her steadily. Nurse Olmstead, I'm going to ask you something and I need an honest answer. A beat. Did you know Denis Chartrand? No, ma'am. Do you have any specific reason to believe his death wasn't an accident? Vera had been carrying the question for 5 days by then, the low-grade, unverifiable suspicion that had started on the drive back from Kodiak when Odette had said, almost as an afterthought, he wasn't sleeping well the last few months. He said something was wrong at work, but he wouldn't tell me what. She looked at Zwicker. I think you might want to find out for sure. The silence in the office lasted a long time. The investigation that followed was not Vera's. She was clear about that to anyone who asked, and she made sure not to know more than she needed to know, and she focused on what she was actually there to do, which was keep a dog alive and functional and, eventually, trustworthy enough to be assessed for rehoming. But investigations have a way of circling back. The thing that eventually came out, 3 weeks into the 30-day assessment period, started with a request from the military police to review Chartrand's operational reports from the previous 6 months. Kodiak had been part of a narcotics sweep of base housing in October. The sweep had flagged a storage unit belonging to a warrant officer named Clive Purefoy. The report had been filed. What had happened to it after filing was less clear. Purefoy had been reassigned to CFB Gagetown in early November. Chartrand had died in January. The timing was the kind of timing that doesn't necessarily mean anything, and also the kind of timing that does. Vera heard the name Purefoy for the first time from Nkemderim, who said it in the way people say names they've only recently learned means something important. She was in the kennel with Kodiak when he said it, sitting on the floor with the dog's head in her lap, working through the command sequences for the 4th day in a row. Purefoy, she repeated. The sweep report, October. Kodiak found something. Nkemderim looked at the dog. The report was filed, and then it got buried. There's a gap in the chain. Vera ran her hand along Kodiak's ear. He had a scar there, just at the base, from an old injury no one had documented. She'd noticed it on the first day. Chartrand would have known, she said. Chartrand filed the report. She thought about Odette. Something was wrong at work. He was scared, she said. Not a question. We think so. Was it an accident? The car? Nkemderim looked at her steadily. The MP investigation is ongoing. She nodded. She didn't ask again. That wasn't her job. Her job was the dog in her lap, the dog who was breathing slowly against her knee and whose tail was making that same slow, uncertain arc it had made on the first day, except now it wasn't uncertain anymore. Purefoy was arrested at CFB Gagetown 6 days before the end of Vera's 30-day assessment period. She found out from the news, which was how she found out most things about that part of it. The military police kept the details inside the investigation, as they should, and she was a flight nurse from 8 Wing who had gotten lost looking for Building D. But the news said, warrant officer arrested in connection with the death of Master Corporal Denis Chartrand. And then, new evidence emerged during a recent assessment of the deceased's military working dog. Vera read it on her phone in the parking lot of the Trenton Walmart, sitting in her car with the heat off. And she thought about Denis Chartrand, whom she had never met, and about the sheet of paper covered in his handwriting, and about the fact that he had been afraid enough to send a copy to his sister just in case something happened, in case someone needed to be able to talk to his dog. She thought he must have known, toward the end, that the thing he'd filed a report about wasn't going away, and she thought he'd been brave about it, in his own quiet way. Not loud brave, just the kind of brave that does what it has to do and doesn't make a speech. She sent Odette a message, nothing detailed. Just, thinking of you today. Kodiak is doing really well. Odette replied with a single photograph. Denis at maybe 30, in civvies, at what looked like a family barbecue, with a younger, leaner Kodiak sitting pressed against his leg, both of them looking at the camera, both of them squinting a little into the sun. The assessment ended with a recommendation for honorable retirement. Vera didn't let herself want it too, obviously, but she wanted it. She'd done the paperwork 3 times to make sure it was right, checking and rechecking the requirements for civilian adoption of retired MWD units, making sure she met each criterion, making sure there was nothing that could be used to say no. Commander Zwicker approved the application on a Friday afternoon in early March, and Nkemderim texted her the moment the confirmation went through. Vera was in the middle of a pre-flight check for a medical transport to Kingston. She read the message twice, put her phone away, finished the check, and cried in the instrument room for approximately 4 minutes before pulling herself together and going to do her job. She picked Kodiak up on a Tuesday. She'd arranged to take a week of leave, and she drove herself to the kennel in the morning with a new collar still in its package on the passenger seat and a pair of running shoes that she planned to wear out on the first day. Inkim was there. So was Hessler, who had apparently arranged to be on duty that morning, and a few others who had various official reasons to be in the kennel that didn't really hold up to scrutiny if you thought about them. Vera didn't say anything about that. She just thought, he earned this. He earned every person who showed up. She clipped the new collar on Kodiak herself. He stood very still for it, watching her face. She said the recall command. Chartrand's version. The Hearst version. The one that wasn't in any textbook. He walked through the kennel door beside her without looking back. Outside, the morning was cold and bright in the way that March mornings in Ontario can be when they decide to be generous, the sky very blue, the snow on the ground starting to think about softening. Kodiak stepped off the concrete onto the strip of frozen ground beside the path and stopped. He lifted his head and breathed. Just breathed. The way a dog breathes when it's remembering what air is. Vera stood beside him and didn't say anything. She gave him the time. She figured he'd earned that too. She applied to a certificate program in animal-assisted therapy that September through Trent University, while still maintaining her nursing hours. She wasn't sure it would go anywhere. She just knew that there was something in the gap between what military dogs needed and what the system was equipped to give them, and that she had accidentally learned how to stand in that gap, and it seemed wasteful to stop. She brought Kodiak to the first class. Not as a demo, just because he was her dog and it was a Tuesday and she didn't want to leave him alone all day. He lay under her desk for 3 hours and did not embarrass her once. The professor, a woman named Dr. Thibodeau who had worked with Veterans Affairs for 20 years, asked afterward about the scar on his ear. Vera told her the story, the abbreviated version. The version that started with a wrong door in Building C and ended with a drive north on a snowy highway and a piece of paper covered in someone else's handwriting. Thibodeau listened with the specific attention of someone who has spent a career learning what actually helps and what just looks like helping, and when Vera finished, she said, "You know there are a dozen dogs in this province right now in exactly that situation." Vera looked at Kodiak, who had stood up to lean his full weight against her leg, which was a thing he did sometimes without warning. "Yeah," she said. "I know. Would you be interested in talking about what a protocol might look like? Something formalized, something that could actually be replicated." Vera looked at the sheet of paper on the professor's desk and then at the dog pressing his weight against her, steady and warm and present. She said, "I think Denis Chartrand would have wanted that." And she meant it. She meant it the way you mean the things you say when you're not performing for anyone, when the room is quiet enough that the only thing left is what's actually true. Outside, the October light was going orange through the window. Kodiak turned his head toward it, the way he always did when the light changed, like he was tracking something Vera couldn't see. She reached down and put her hand on his back, and he leaned into it, and they stayed there like that for a while. The nurse and the dog and the long work still ahead of them, and all the doors they were going to walk through together before they were done.